Butter was not created for taste. For most of human history, butter existed for one reason: survival. Long before recipes, before restaurants, before indulgence, fat was life. Fat meant energy. Fat meant warmth. Fat meant making it through winter when nothing grew and animals were scarce. Butter was one of the most reliable ways humans learned to save that fat. Milk itself was fragile. Fresh milk spoiled quickly. In many climates, it lasted only hours before turning sour. Without cooling, without clean storage, milk could not be trusted to last even a single day. But when milk was churned, something changed. Fat separated from water. What remained was dense, stable energy. Butter turned a perishable liquid into stored survival. This mattered most in cold regions. Northern climates were defined by long winters and short growing seasons. Fields went dormant. Vegetables disappeared. Hunting was unreliable. Survival depended almost entirely on what had been saved during warmer months. Butter was one of the few foods that could bridge that gap. People didn't eat butter because it tasted good. They ate it because it kept them alive. It delivered calories when nothing else could. It fueled bodies that had to work even when food was scarce. A small amount could sustain labor for hours. Butter was packed away for winter. It was salted to extend its life. In some cultures, it was buried underground in cold earth or bogs to preserve it even longer. These weren't traditions or curiosities. They were practical responses to fear. A buried crock of butter wasn't comfort food. It was insurance. Butter also moved differently than other foods. Unlike milk, it could travel. It could be carried between settlements. It could be traded. It could be rationed. In a world where calories were difficult to store, butter became portable energy. That made butter powerful. Where butter was plentiful, people survived longer winters. Where it was scarce, hunger arrived earlier and stayed longer. Butter quietly shaped which populations endured and which struggled. Over time, butter became tied to land and animals. Cows required pasture. Pasture required land. Land required control. Butter production reflected who owned resources and who did not. This is where butter began to divide class. For poor households, butter was precious. It was measured carefully, saved for the coldest days, used when illness struck or labor demanded more energy than usual. Butter wasn't spread freely. It was guarded. For wealthier households, butter became more available. It softened bread. It enriched meals. It signaled that survival was not constantly in question. Butter moved from emergency resource to everyday presence. Butter didn't replace hunger. It replaced fear. Winter didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly. Days shortened. Light faded earlier. Temperatures dropped just enough to change how people moved. Fresh food disappeared first. Vegetables stopped growing. Milk production slowed. Animals burned more energy just to stay warm. This is when butter mattered most. Butter wasn't eaten casually in winter. It was rationed, measured, watched. A household knew exactly how much butter remained. They knew how many weeks it had to last. They knew what would happen if it ran out too early. Butter wasn't used for pleasure. It was used for endurance. A small portion could carry a person through a long day of labor. A thin layer on bread could prevent weakness. A bit added to soup could mean the difference between exhaustion and survival. Every use of butter was a decision. Families adjusted meals based on weather, on how hard the cold felt that week, on how much strength was still needed to get through the season. There were days when butter was not eaten at all, saved, preserved, protected. And there were days when it had to be used, even if it meant risking the future. That decision carried weight. Butter was checked constantly, smelled, touched, examined for spoilage. If it failed, there was no replacement. Losing butter in winter didn't mean discomfort. It meant hunger. It meant weakness. It meant fear. This is why butter was buried, why it was salted, why it was hidden away. Not for tradition, not for ritual, for survival. Butter carried people through weeks when nothing else could. Winter taught respect. In many societies, butter took on symbolic meaning. It appeared in religious offerings. It was associated with abundance, blessing, and protection. In some cultures, butter or clarified fat was burned, gifted, or reserved for sacred moments. This symbolism wasn't abstract. It came from experience. People knew exactly what butter meant when winter stretched on and stores ran low. Butter represented stored life. Butter also tied people to time. Summer milk became winter survival. Warm months fed cold ones. Churning butter wasn't just a task. It was a transformation. It was how people carried sunlight forward. This labor was constant. Milk had to be processed daily. Butter had to be protected from heat, light, and spoilage. Losing it meant real danger. Preservation required knowledge, attention, and care. Butter demanded respect. As farming improved, butter production increased. Churning became routine. Families organized their days around milk processing. This labor often fell to women, whose work directly determined whether households survived winter. Butter connected effort to outcome in the clearest way possible. If it was made well and stored properly, people lived. If it spoiled, people suffered. Then industrialization arrived. Mechanical churning increased output. Refrigeration slowed spoilage. Transportation allowed butter to move farther than ever before. What had once been seasonal and local became constant and global. Butter stopped being insurance and became ingredient. Its role changed quietly. Butter moved from survival food to comfort food, from necessity to pleasure, from guarded resource to expected staple. This shift changed perception. Modern people think of butter as indulgent, rich, excessive, optional. But that judgment only exists in a world where calories are abundant and winter no longer threatens starvation. For most of history, butter was not indulgence. It was discipline. It was stored, measured, protected. Using too much at once wasn't luxury, it was recklessness. Butter also reshaped flavor. Fat carries taste. As butter became more available, food changed. Grains softened. Vegetables became easier to eat. Cooking methods shifted. Survival food became more tolerable. Taste followed survival, not the other way around. Butter also influenced bodies over generations. Regions with steady access to dairy developed different physical endurance, labor capacity, and dietary expectations than regions without it. This wasn't culture alone. It was biology responding to available energy. As butter became common, its history faded. Refrigeration erased the urgency. Grocery stores hid the labor. Butter became anonymous. It lost its story. But the body didn't forget. Humans are wired to value fat because fat once meant safety. Butter triggers that ancient recognition. Comfort foods rely on butter, not just because it tastes good, but because it signals nourishment at a deep level. That's why butter feels grounding, why it feels complete, why it feels different from oil. Even now, butter panic reveals its old role. When supply chains falter, butter disappears quickly. People stockpile it instinctively, not because they need recipes, but because fat still signals security. Butter was never about luxury. Luxury came later. Butter was about surviving winter, about storing energy, about turning fragile milk into lasting life. It was buried, salted, protected. Butter didn't make food fancy. It made survival possible. And that's why, even now, butter still feels essential, even when we pretend it isn't.